Yo, thank you for clicking on this video. Today is a new kind of format. I'm stood here with a whiteboard and we're going to be going through all the different property strategies that are out there. And if you're an aspiring investor or developer looking to get into property, then this should give you a good rundown of each of the strategies and considerations you'll need to make. Subscribe, and let's get into the video. And by the way, we're in our temporary offices at the moment, so sorry for the mess behind me, but upstairs the lads are fitting out our new office. Considerations. Before you choose a strategy, you want to consider what kind of person you are, what kind of preferences you have, what's your capital position, your risk appetite. So there's cash flow. Do you want cash flow? Do you want equity? What's your appetite to liability, and assessing the liability that you currently have in your own life and what you're willing to take on through a financial investment into a property asset. Barrier to entry, how much capital you've got at the moment, your knowledge, how old you are, your connections, things like that. Risk, appetite to risk, pretty obvious one. Market dynamics. Do you want to hedge against market dynamics? Do you have multiple investments at the moment and you want to get an asset-backed investment through property in the UK? Diversification. Do you want to be diversified within your given strategy? Do you want to do multiple units? Do you want multiple sources of income? Do you want a bit of capital appreciation and a bit of cash flow, but you're not too bothered about either or? There's all sorts of things to think about. And time. How much time do you have to commit to a strategy? These are things you need to think about. Profile yourself first before picking a strategy because you may like the sound of it. Because if you don't have any time, you don't have any capital, you don't have resources or friends, then this probably isn't for you. So make sure you go through this, itemize yourself, then pick a strategy. So what are the strategies we're going to look at? We're going to look at rent-to-rents, buy-to-lets, HMOs, and larger projects. So rent-to-rents, if you don't know already, we're going to keep the description quite short, but basically you rent a property from a landlord, and you rent that for a certain amount, and then you might rent it out on a higher revenue-based strategy. So let's say it's service apartments, you can then get a nightly rate that's then higher than the rent you're giving the landlord. You arbitrage the in-between. Same with HMOs, you could divide up a landlord's house, rent out on HMOs, get money per room, and you're just paying rent to the landlord, but you don't own the asset. It's purely a contracts-based business. That's rent-to-rents. Buy-to-lets, you must have heard of this strategy, very common. You buy a house, or it could be an apartment, but let's say it's a house, you rent it out to a family on a long-term tenancy, you benefit from the income and the appreciation of the property. Buy-to-lets, straightforward. HMOs, so that is where you buy a terraced house, or it could be any kind of house, but let's take a terraced house, you split it into rooms, and then you rent out the rooms individually. So you're getting more income per square footage in that property. It's a great high-yielding strategy, but it comes with inherent risks. So that's HMOs, and then there's larger projects. Larger projects, we're going to touch on a little bit in this video, but frankly, there's a huge then long subsidiary lists of large projects that you could do, like commercial to residential, build to rents, new builds, commercial projects, warehouses, all kinds of stuff. So we're just going to look at basic large projects. So, an apartment block of say 10 to 20 units, or commercial to residential conversion, offices to apartments. But if you're watching this video, you're probably not ready for that stage yet. However, you may have a ton of cash and can't be bothered to do this stuff. You don't mind losing a bit of money, taking on some risk and learning on the way. In which case, you may just want to have a gamble, go into a larger project. We actually did do that. I don't advise it, but our first project was a pub conversion, and call it luck, but we got through the other side of it. However, things could have gone differently. It could have wiped us out. So start somewhere here. Don't start there. So rent-to-rents, now we know what they are. Let's look at it through our considerations and think about you as a person and how that marries up to this strategy, and also just the merits in each strategy. I personally don't do rent-to-rents. They're not for me. It's not something I'm interested in. However, it doesn't mean that they don't work. But you need to think about this in detail. Cash flow, quick. It's not necessarily loads of cash flow, can be relative to your time input, but cash flow does come quickly because you can turn around the property quite quick if you secure the right property. You slap some furniture in there, get it on Airbnb, get up your softwares, Avivo, OTAs, Booking.com, things like that, and you could start renting out on a nightly basis and make some good whack within 4 to 6 weeks of signing the contract. So cash flow can be quick. The size of the cash flow will depend on how good you are at securing the right property for the right price. Equity, none. Literally no equity. It's a contracts-based business. Liability, high. You've got high liability because you don't own the asset. So if something goes wrong, damage or there's new regs that come in and you need to reinvest into the asset, well, you don't own it. So you have to speak to the landlord and you're going to be in a fixed contract with him and he may not be willing to contribute to the property. And in which case you're stuck with then spending your rent on upgrading the asset rather than taking it home, which is the whole point of this strategy, because you may have a 5-year fixed contract. And if you're using, say, years of that income to pay for upgrades in the property or pay for damage, then that's a liability. So I'd say it is a heavy liability strategy. Some people would argue otherwise. However, I think if you own the asset, you have a lot more flexibility. Barrier to entry is low. You don't need a lot of money. 5 grand could get one of these off the ground. 3 grand could. Maybe even not very much at all, close to little, but let's just say it's 5 grand to get one of these up and running properly. So barrier to entry is good. You don't necessarily need a lot of knowledge, but you certainly need some knowledge to get this done. You've got to understand the contracts. You've got to understand what you're looking for, understand how to appraise the market. So knowledge is key. Throughout all of this, knowledge is key. Barrier to entry. Risk. Moderate. I wouldn't say you got a massive risk here. Worst case scenario, let's say you don't have a great occupancy rate in your SA, or 2 tenants aren't paying you for your rent to HMO, then you might be losing out on a few £100 a month, possibly £1,000 a month at a worst case, unless something goes really bad. That's 12 grand in a fiscal year. It's not the end of the world, but certainly the risk is moderate. It's not none. It's not super high like a commercial to residential development. Market dynamics, you are vulnerable to market dynamics. And I say that because at the moment, service accommodation is getting scrutinized from a regulatory standpoint. They're going to start treating service departments in the not too distant future like HMOs. So you need fire compartmentation, fire doors, and all kinds of other bits and pieces in there, which for anyone who's got a rent to rent fixed at the moment on SA, if that comes in, it's not going to come in overnight, but it will come in gradually. And as it does come in, you might be stuck in a long-term contract where you're then going to have to spend 5-10 grand fixing up a property, depends on the size, and you don't own it. It's coming out of your rent roll, so you're wasting your time doing the rent to rent because it's just going to servicing someone else's asset. So I do think you're vulnerable to market dynamics. Look at the current market we're in right now with interest rates going up. The landlord you have the contract with might default on his mortgage, his interest payments might go through the roof, he needs to up his rent, the asset might get repossessed, all kinds of things can happen in a fluctuating market. And if you don't inherently own the asset, you cannot control the outcome. Diversification, minimal. Yes, you could flip a service rent to SA to a rent to HMO. There's not really much by way of diversification with a rent to rent. Sure, you could get multiple rent to rents. That's a different story because then if anything, you're upping your liability. And to really diversify in rent to rents, you're going to have to be a very good operator because it is a contracts-based business. There is income, there is OPEX, and then there is the in-between, which is your profit. And you need to get good at using your time to then leverage that business to bring in staff so you can open up more time to grow it, to then produce more income. But during that period, which will take you a number of years, you're going to have expiring contracts coming closer and closer to the end of the landlords. So it's in that sense, it's a hard business to scale big unless you have good business acumen. You may be able to do it. I'm not saying you can't, but I'd say it's difficult. So diversification, which would come with scale in rent to rents, is difficult. Time consuming. It is very time consuming for the reasons I mentioned before. Unless you are self-managing the rent to rents, there's not a great deal of profit in them. And I know there's people out there selling courses who say, yes, there's loads of profit in these, make money tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. But it's only when you actually run these things for years that you realize that year on year and your annualized returns on your time are very low. You really need to self-manage. Hence the point that you need to be a good operator to get this to scale. You need systems, processes, bring in staff at the right points, delegate out and build and build and build. It's not an easy task. So time consuming. On to the next strategy. Right now, on to buy-to-lets. So cash flow wise, depends on your gearing. What I mean by that is buy-to-lets are a great strategy for cash flow if you don't get any mortgages, you don't get any lending. You're essentially parking capital into an asset-backed investment and it's going to kick off a load of income each month. And if you're not paying out on a mortgage, you might get a 7-8% return, which is a bit measly, but it's far better than being sat in the bank account. In which case that makes buy-to-lets good for cash flow. If you're gearing it, that's when you have to be careful. Really know your numbers because in this kind of market where interest rates shoot up, that could wipe out most of the cash flow on your buy-to-let. So by no means are buy-to-lets dead, like a lot of people say they are. It just depends on your cap stack. How are you financing the deals? Equity, good. You're getting exposure to equity. You're getting ownership, so that's good. Liability, again, depends on your gearing, depends on your mortgage, and then it's a single tenant. So if you get a bad tenant in there, so make sure you've got good managing agents with good referencing protocols, you want to make sure that that tenant is going to pay every month. Because if they don't pay, that's all your income gone. Because you're relying on one tenant, which is where HMOs are better because you diversify the income. Barrier to entry, moderate. You don't need that much capital. You can get them done for about 30 to 50 grand if you get in development finance and things like that. It's not a lot of money in the realms of property development. So moderate barrier to entry, don't need a lot of knowledge either. It's pretty straightforward, but you do need to know something about managing contractors, appraising the area, things like that. But it's quite high level stuff. Most people should be able to get buy-to-lets done. Risk, low. I don't think there's a lot of risk in this. The refurbs are pretty straightforward. The back end market is in abundance because there's so many people without housing that if you stick a buy-to-let on the market right now in any half decent borough, you're gonna have 30 people show up to a viewing. So risk, I'd say, is moderate. Market dynamics, again, depends on gearing. If interest rates go up in the market, you have another Liz Truss moment, and you've got a portfolio of buy-to-lets, they're about to run out of their fixed rates with your lender, you could be in serious trouble. And also, there can be changes in policy. Right now, government is talking about more changes to AST contracts, which is basically the tenant's rights and their relationship with the landlord and the managing agent. It's going to make it more and more difficult to kick tenants out. Not that you'd want to kick a tenant out if they're paying their rent, but there can be circumstances where a tenant doesn't pay their rent, or they're struggling with the cost of living and they can't pay their rent. All kinds of things can happen. So keeping an eye on policy, keeping an eye on what Parliament are doing with the rental market, rental caps and things like that. Not that I think they'll bring them in here, that's for another video, but it's something to look at, keep an eye on. If you're aggressively building a buy-to-let portfolio, you could be gearing yourself up for disaster if you're not aware of what policies may be coming down the road. Then diversification. So if you're building a portfolio, obviously the buy-to-let on its own is a single tenant. There's not much you can do there. You could flip it to SA or to a HMO strategy, and because you've got ownership, you're within your right to do that as long as you follow the right licensing. But if you're scaling just a buy-to-let portfolio, then geographical diversification, having in slightly different towns or different areas of the town, could be a way to diversify. And the gearing. Let's say you've got 10 properties, you might have 5 of them geared to the hilt and 5 of them on a low gearing, gives you a bit of a hedge. You could flog those ones off in a bad market and you've still protected your other ones, use the capital to pay those down. You can diversify buy-to-lets. Time, low if delegated. You don't need to put a lot of time into buy-to-lets. If you delegate out everything or hire a project manager or work with a service like us where we do this all for you, shameless plug, then this can be done quite easily. Not a lot of time input and not a lot of expertise required. Obviously, the boots on the ground need the expertise, but you, the developer, the investor, can partner with people who can do the work for you. Now we'll move on to HMOs. My favorite strategy. It's why we built the foundation of our business around HMOs, because they're just a good strategy. It's just a good thing to do. So cash flow, strong and secure. Strong and secure because you've got multiple tenants in one property, all paying income, and pound per square foot is much higher than a buy-to-let. But obviously there's a cost of infrastructure to get it to that level, like with en-suites, fire provisions, and other things like that. Equity, good. Again, same as buy-to-lets, you're exposed to the equity and capital growth in the long term. And obviously you can play on leverage returns, which I'll talk about in another video. Not many people are aware of leverage returns, but it's a great way to take your capital and expose yourself to a lot more capital appreciation going into the future. Liability depends on your knowledge, completely depends. HMOs can finish you. They can completely strip you of all your money. I've watched it happen, and we literally picked up a distressed asset off a developer who lost about 40 grand, and they didn't hardly even touch the ground. They basically just did a strip out and they got screwed by a contractor. They didn't follow the right procedure and lost a lot of money. So you can lose a lot of money doing this. HMOs, you've got to know what you're doing, or partner with people who do. Again, we offer that service, so hit us up at info@buypartners.co.uk if you want to join us. Yeah, liability depends on knowledge. Barrier to entry, higher than buy-to-lets, but not crazy high. Sure, you need more capital. You need really between 100 to 150 grand to get one of these done, and that's assuming you're going to borrow the balance. But yeah, if you're up in the northeast like we are, the northwest, property asset values are quite a bit cheaper. You could pick up something for around 100 grand and spend, say, 100 grand on it all in. You're around about 200 grand capex. But if you're borrowing the development finance, then 100 grand could get you there. But the barrier to entry also is knowledge. So if you don't have the knowledge, then I wouldn't advise jumping into this. I'd advise joint venturing with someone who's got the knowledge, or go and acquire the knowledge through reading books, online videos, courses. They do work. We'll offer them soon. Stay tuned. Risk. Risk depends on knowledge. Again, knowledge, risk. There's a load of compliance you've got to follow when you're doing HMOs, and they are more capital intensive because of the fire provisions and suspended ceilings and other bits and bobs that you need to put in, more en suites, furniture. So your risk is higher on your capital required and riskier on just making sure that the compliance is followed properly and that you pick the right contractor and that the HMO officer's happy at the back end. You get acoustic sign-offs and all sorts of other stuff depending on the size of the property, planning permission. So there is a lot more risk in HMOs than there is in buy-to-lets, but if you have the right knowledge, you can mitigate the risk. Market dynamics. So again, the same thing. Gearing is, well, what level of money are you borrowing compared to how much capital you have deployable to get the job done, and then on the back end as well, how much are you borrowing, interest payments compared to your income. Know your numbers. Regulation changes. So if there's changes to regs, you need to understand and be ahead of them before jumping in to a HMO project. Ultimately, once you've got the license and you're out the back end, the regs can't affect you for a long time until you get a new license, when they then may ask you to up the standards, but you get what's called grandfather rights when you have finished a project within certain regulatory bandwidths. If they change the regs after that, that doesn't affect you. You've got grandfather rights. Diversification, good, because you've got multiple tenants. So if two of them don't pay from their rooms, well, it's all right, because the rest of the tenants in the property are covering all your fixed costs and therefore hedging against your downside. So it's good diversification for HMOs. That's another reason why we like them, because it lowers that risk element on the back end. And time. More than buy-to-lets, again, you can subby out most of the time if you partner with people like us or other joint venture partners. They can take on a large part of the work for you. If you want to be an armchair investor, then that is possible to do with HMOs, but you really want to know what you're stepping into. Even if you're just an investor, make sure you understand the process, understand HMOs, at least to a high level, before you part ways with capital with your joint venture partners. That's HMOs. Large projects, right, this is a minefield. We could go on for ages. So let's just look at a high level, assuming you're doing commercial to residential of a certain scale and you're capable of taking it on. So cash flow can be great. What is your exit? Are you selling it? Are you keeping it? Let's assume you're keeping it. Cash flow can be really good. You could split it into multiple studios. You could do PBSA. You could do all kinds of things, service departments with AST apartments. You got to know your regs, know your planning. But yeah, your cash flow is going to be higher just because of the sheer volume. It doesn't mean that your cash on cash, i.e. the cash you put in, is getting higher returns. It just means that for your time spent, you are getting a volume benefit, because you might spend, say, 2 years on that project and get 40 apartments out of it, compared to, say, the same 2 years taking you through just 3 HMO projects. So you're getting time, volume benefits. So that's something to think about, the larger projects. And it's ultimately why most developers end up doing them, because they just don't want to spend their time doing small projects. They want to just compound that and do bigger and bigger and bigger. Equity, same exact thing. Depends on your exit. It's a volume game. So these two kind of work hand in hand. Liability, high. Your high liability across the board. You've got all kinds of things that can come into larger scale projects, from planning permission to buying the wrong sort of property for your strategy, not knowing your numbers enough because the construction costs could be here, there and everywhere. If you're doing a large scale construction, then you could be exposed to material costs going up. You've got service connections, building regs, licensing, certifications, all kinds of things that come into these larger scale projects. So your liability just across the board is higher. And on the back end, if you're refinancing it or selling it, then again, your liabilities are going to be higher, because what market are you in? Which ties into market conditions and risks. Barrier to entry high, you need a lot of capital, and if you don't have a lot of capital, you need a lot of knowledge to go raise the capital. So barrier to entry is certainly high. If you're starting with a few million quid and you want to go and spunk it up the wall and just do a large project and you don't mind losing a bit of money, that's up to you. People do it, but I just wouldn't advise starting here if you haven't done any of the previous strategies before. Risk. So risk is high, and it's finance dependent, really. Most of the risk in all of this comes down to how much money you got, how much money is on the line, how much have you borrowed relative to the value in the property. So it's all down to finance. But on the bigger projects, finance is the most crippling part, because a month's delay could be the difference of 100 grand's worth of interest, depending on how big the project is. Could be 10 grand's worth of interest, but it could be large relative to the cost of the scheme. So know your numbers, because the risk on financing costs can be mega. Market dynamics is project specific. It depends what kind of project you're doing. If you're selling and you're going into a market like we have now, where homeowners or first-time buyers are looking at mortgage rates through the hilt and just can't afford to buy, then obviously you need to be aware of those market dynamics. But sometimes you just can't know. No one knew Liz Truss was going to have her fad in Parliament, and no one knew that Putin was going to invade Ukraine. But all those things had a huge adverse effect on property developers. We felt it ourselves massively, and I know a lot of other people did, and a lot of people went bust because of it. If you have multiple exit strategies and good liquidity, then you can hedge against market dynamics, but know that at the start. Know what you're stepping into. Unfortunately, you can't guess what the market's going to do, but you can try and prepare for each eventuality. Diversification, good, because obviously you're building multiple units, there's multiple sources of income. You could split titles, sell them off. You could have commercial on the ground, resi on the uppers, all kinds of stuff you could do. Diversification on larger projects genuinely is good. Time gone. You just don't have any time left. You're going to take on something like this yourself. It's going to eat you completely. It's going to eat you alive, unless you can afford to delegate everything out, which again, people can do, or you have staff like we do who can take on different portions of that project, and we can delegate it to different departments. Then obviously that's the way you can scale something like this. But if you're just starting out, or you've done a few HMOs, you want to go into larger projects, assume that most of your time is going to be swallowed by this one endeavor. And that's large projects. So what do we need to think about? What do you need to do property development at any level? First, you need knowledge. So buy our course, coming out soon. You need knowledge. Jokes aside, you need knowledge no matter what you're doing. You've got to read books, you've got to speak to people, you've got to network. You got to look at online videos, all kinds of stuff to just acquire the right knowledge so that you can then implement and take on a strategy, know how to appraise a strategy, know more about yourself and is it something you really want to be doing, which is why I suggest reading books and doing stuff online first before buying courses, because you may just not like property. It may just not be for you. If you don't like risk, I just don't do property because it's risky and it's time consuming and it's pressure. So have the right knowledge. And then when you have the right knowledge, you should then be able to pick the right strategy. Pick the right strategy, something that works for you. Again, I put more emphasis on avatar yourself, profile yourself. What kind of person are you? And then pick a strategy that suits you. And over time, you may evolve. Capital. Do you have any capital? You need capital, no matter what. You either need to borrow it from someone else, you need to have it yourself, you need to create some savings, you need to go to a bank and ask them for money, mortgages, bridging, development finance. No matter what, if you're in property, you need capital. Sure, rent to rents, you maybe don't need as much, but you don't want to do rent to rents forever, right? So at some point, you're going to need a lot of capital. Time, massive. Do you have the time? You need time to do this, to just get the knowledge or to implement the strategy or to raise the capital. So time is very important. Understand how much you have to dispense, and that will help you figure out exactly what you're doing in the property realm. Determination, probably the most important part, because property development, frankly, is fraught with difficulty. You could set out the most immaculate business plan in the world, like to the letter, systems, processes, you could throw a load of money at it. But no matter what, your plan's going to go wrong at some point. You just can't help it because market dynamics, because Liz Truss, because Putin, because whatever reason, or just through your own oversight, like you miss something. Determination will get you through all of those problems. If you are not determined to meet your end goal and you don't have that hunger inside of you to be able to take a project from the start to completion, no matter how bad the journey's been through the middle, then you just won't cut it in property development. And that's why 99% of people start a property journey and don't really get very far, because they just don't have that last quality. And that's it. That's this video. I hope it's been useful to any of you out there looking to try and get into property or already in property and want to explore other strategies. I'm trying to be helpful and trying to give as much information as I can from my standpoint, my experience. But let me know in the comments, drop me a comment and see what you think of these strategies. Are there any other strategies you want me to talk about? Or do you like this format of video? Do you want me to do more videos like this? Because I'm happy to talk about all kinds of other stuff in property and investment and raising capital. And yes, soon we will be doing courses and mentoring. So stay tuned for that and hope it's been a useful video. Subscribe.